So we'll get started with, very quickly, what is Kotlin? It is a static, better Java by Jetbrains. To put it very succinctly, announced in 2011, V1 in 2016, Google thumbs up in 2017, and there are endless talks about Kotlin and what it is. So I'm going to stop there and let you go find those if you're not aware of what Kotlin is. Kotlin can render to multiple targets. And obviously, it was kind of designed for the JVM initially, but you can output JavaScript and native. What Kotlin Multiplatform really is taking a common Kotlin that can be compatible with all these, and then when you compile them, they get output in these particular targets, right? So JVM is what you'd expect. It's Java bytecode. JavaScript is JavaScript. I mean, it's functional, but let's see how popular that gets. I don't know. No offense. And native. And native, to be clear, we're at a mobile development conference, but native is iOS, but also Linux, Windows, various other things, IoT, anything you can kind of touch with LLVM, and that includes WebAssembly, which we'll talk a bit about later. So I'm going to take a quick detour and talk about bigger picture. So I spend a lot of time at these conferences talking about these things, and I think the discussion around cross-platform is a lot broken, right? Native developers, especially at a native developer conference, tend to have done a lot of native development and are doing just the beginning of cross-platform stuff, right? So in the beginning, like, the understanding tends to be like native versus like not native, right? And this is sort of this weird musical analogy I came up with at 2 a.m. Bear with me. But, you know, it kind of, the discussions I get into sort of feel like this, where it's like, I tried cross-platform and it didn't work, so I don't do that. And it's like, okay, but there's a bigger world. And then it's like, oh, I read the blog post about React Native from Airbnb, and that sucked, or that was great, and they didn't put enough resources into it, so cross-platform is great or terrible. You know what I mean? Like, it's not nuanced at all. And then after some time and reading blog posts and sort of like getting more into it, you kind of like, okay, we're gonna like better understand these things, but it's still like, the discussion, I would say, is kind of a surface understanding, especially everyone who read that Airbnb blog post. It's like the Rorschach of like what I think about cross-platform, and people just pick little lines, and that becomes their whole argument. Anyway, let's keep rolling. I think this is a far more valid categorization, at least musically. And the point of all that is just to say, look, cross-platform is not a thing. It is a very big world with a lot of weird stuff, and it's all over the map. So to say cross-platform versus native is like, doesn't make sense as an argument. To say Flutter or Kotlin Multiplatform doesn't make sense as an argument. They're not apples to apples, right? So it's very useful if you're going to get into this to understand the ecosystem. And if you're a Motorhead fan, Lemmy said that directly. Little Richard was responsible for Motorhead. Anyway, so moving on. It is definitely a crowded discussion field, and if you go Google stuff, it is kind of all over the place and gets a little bananas. So I should have sped up these animations. How are we doing? Okay, there we go. You know, TLDR, the debate's generally not very interesting. It really, you could build a taxonomy diagram like this, and it would take a lot of time, but there are, you know, tens and possibly hundreds of different things out there. You know, React Native and Flutter and Kotlin Multiplatform, they're all vertebrates, but like one's a bird, one's a dog, one's a fish, right? So it's like, it's kind of hard to do just apples to oranges. You have to understand what they are. Speaking of Flutter, if it's done anything, it has made it socially acceptable to talk about cross-platform at a native developer conference. So I can tell you for the last few years, it was not super socially acceptable to talk about it. What's Kotlin Multiplatform? It is, these are the species traits. It is a shared testable architecture, not UI. Okay, smooth interop, and by that I mean not exceptional integrations. Like, you don't need to crack open C++ when you talk to the native code. It's optional code sharing, so it's not trying to like be the locus of everything for your app. You can just put some stuff in and talk to it like any other library. Active community. Kotlin has an active community, and it will be growing considerably for this stuff. Good tools, it's Jetbrains. That is understatement. Jetbrains is the best tool maker in the industry right now. And bonus, one platform is 100% native. The Android side is nothing's weird. It's just a dependency. Getting a call. That's an Apple Watch. Sorry. The Android side is 100% native, right? So, and that's kind of why, if you know who I am and you've been following my rants for the last few years, we got it to Doppel and J2OBJC for the same things. Doppel and Kotlin Multiplatform are both dogs, except not all dogs are the same. You know, one tech kind of had this flavor, and another tech kind of had sort of this flavor, and we'll see how all that stuff goes. And to completely kill the analogy, Kotlin Multiplatform is the fast dog, but it's still a puppy. So there's a lot of training that needs to happen. That's our puppy. I can't predict the future. I don't know if Flutter is going to be big or nothing. I don't know if PWA is going to like roll over everything. I don't know if it's just going to be native. I don't know what's going to happen next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. But I like to make safe bets. And I gave a much longer talk about this in Berlin recently. Doing shared architecture with top-notch tools with this platform, I would say without a doubt, in 10 years, this is still a viable way to be building apps, regardless of how you're rendering your UI. And to me, that's a very safe bet. So that was more the business case, yada, yada. Our friend Jack gave a talk at that same conference about how Chrome and the web is really blurring the lines between like native and web mobile. And I really kind of agree with what he was saying, especially in terms of how WebAssembly is going to have an impact on these things. We'll see how it goes. You never know. Kotlin's definitely right in the middle of that stuff there, and it's very interesting. You should watch it. And he called me out in it as the only person who knows that ever talked about J2OBJC at a conference. So now I'm famous, I guess. Anyway, that's the end of the detour. On with the code. So, common. So you take common code, and you can render that down to the platforms, right? So in your apps, when you are building an Android app or a web thing or an iOS thing, you essentially just call into these outputs as if they're just another library. And henceforth, we're going to kind of ignore the web because we're at a mobile conference and, you know, one thing at a time. Anyway, so what was I going to say? Again, it's very important to understand that it's just calling into these as another library. They don't try to own everything. They don't treat native as an exception. So it really sort of looks like this. Your Android is just like doing Android stuff and then includes this other thing as a regular dependency and calls into it. Similarly, on the native side, you're just making a framework. Xcode's calling another framework. You're calling it from Swift. It's got a really natural interaction, which, again, going back to the differences between tools, like one of the things that's terrible about React Native is that weird bridge and the C++ and the teams like having to deal with that. And one of the main points of this is like you don't really get that, and like it's hard to stress that until you try it, until you see it work. So we'll look at some code in a bit. Anyway, common. So common by itself, it's actually pretty boring. There's not a lot you can do if you don't know where you are, right? So you might be in an environment with threads or not threads. You know, you might be on a phone, you might be on a server, you might be in somebody's cable box. Like, who knows what you're doing? Rather than try to like guess at a bunch of platform interactions, again, because it's easy to integrate with the native stuff, Kotlin Multiplatform makes you kind of put that stuff in there. So the way it works is, let's say I wanted to find out if I'm in the main thread, right? You know, they went pretty lean, so there's no main thread method in the standard Kotlin stuff. So to do this, you add a thing called an expect. So in this case, it's an expect property called main thread, and it returns a Boolean. And then on the particular platform you're on, let's say Android, we're just figuring out whether or not we're in the main thread on Android. And if you're like on iOS, we're figuring out how if you're in the main thread on iOS. It's pretty straightforward, just to see what JavaScript looks like. It's always true, because there's only one thread, which is always the main thread. That's how that works. The droidcon app, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later, we essentially were just going through, and as we ran into stuff we needed, just made a function and then implemented it on the different sides, right? So threading, I need to get current time millis, simple gets for networking, log exception, yada, 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 create UUID. Then you can also do classes. You can do expect on different types of artifacts. So There's properties, classes, annotations, enums, maybe standalone objects, I forget, but don't quiz me. So anyway, you can do classes. Kotlin Common comes with no date functionality, which is one of those first libraries that needs to get built like ASAP. But anyway, we needed a little date and a little date format. On Android, it's implemented with Java util date, and then the simple date formatter, which you should be familiar with as Java. The iOS side does something equivalent, and I'll spare you that. Anyway, type alias. Type alias is an interesting way to implement the expect actual. So if your type is exactly, the signature is exactly the same, then you can do a type alias. So when we implemented the SQLite stack for Kotlin Multiplatform, this is what the Android side looks like. And it's very clean. I mean, it's part of it. There's another whole section of it, but we just map the types directly in. And then since we did the iOS side, it literally looks like that. So if you kind of know how to architect the stuff, it really turns into a very clean implementation, and stuff works really well, with some caveats I'll share out later after the talk. Some bugs need to get upvoted and fixed. Anyway, that's how expect actual works. You're saying, I expect this thing to be there, and then you define it, and they'll let you know if it's not, right? And that's what's great about, again, having good tooling for whatever the thing you're working on. I don't do live code because that's just super risky, but I do live code videos. So this is implementing the main thread property value thing we talked about. It's red, you can't see it, but you just right-click it, and it implements a stub, and then you do it. And this is Jetbrains. Everyone knows and loves IntelliJ and Jetbrains and all that stuff. So this stuff works really well. And that's one of the main reasons why Kotlin was successful. Like, without the tooling support, there's several other things, Celion and Extend from Eclipse, and that just didn't take off. At least in the Android world, I have no idea what's happening on the server. Good luck to all of them. Okay, so the other way you can integrate stuff is define a lambda. So some things I found easier to define as lambdas rather than this expect actual thing. So in the initialization of the app, the top one is a static file loader, and essentially it lets you load seed data for the droidcon app. So you load JSON files from either assets or the bundles in iOS. And on Android, we just passed in, hey, load asset, and it constructs a string name. And then on iOS, my Swift syntax understanding is not what you'd call great, so I split this up. But there's a function name, load asset, and define down there. Same thing, 2 strings, returns a string, gets from the bundle, and you're done, right? So that's kind of the other way you can do integrations. And it's pretty smooth. Everything works together pretty well. And that's that. So integrating stuff, there's a common platform, Gradle. The dependencies, this is a weird syntax, but it's just defined in another place. It's still the 3-part group, artifact version, all the dependency stuff. It's very familiar, it should be. On the platform-specific side, you have a native thing here. The only thing that's different is expected by. And expected by is just another dependency config that essentially says, in this dependency, I have some expects, and I'm going to define them here. And that's it. It's not super complicated once you get used to it. The weird stuff is when you start getting into iOS-specific, native-specific configs, linker stuff. I'm not even going to talk about that. It is kind of weird, not well documented. Welcome to software development. Anyway, status. As of today, the development released published artifacts are kind of at 0.9. The release is really .82, but whatever. It's not quite 1, but it's very stable. However, there's stuff that they're still sorting out. So what you code today is going to change over the next 6 months, absolutely. But if you know what you're doing, you could put this stuff in production. Tooling, the Android side's great. The iOS side, the native side, there was some confusion. Originally, it was going to be CLion. That didn't make sense in a lot of ways. IntelliJ currently doesn't see the native code, so you don't get that autocomplete stuff, and everything is kind of back to coding in Notepad, which, either fond memories or not. Yeah, but obviously it's Jetbrains that's going to get fixed. I'm assuming KotlinConf is when that will be fixed by, which is early October at the latest. Speed. Build speed is not good. I can't say it any other way, but it is absolutely new, and they're obviously focused on getting things to work, and then it will be optimized. How much? I don't know, but whatever. Actual running speed is like phenomenal. There's actually a layer that looks like JNI between the Kotlin and the Kotlin native C++ stuff, but it's not JNI. It's direct, and it's just type definition. So super fast. I expect it to be faster than a lot of the JVM stuff that you would run, which I know is scandalous, but whatever. Okay, and libraries. The big thing now is that there are basically no libraries, and that's like the big thing that needs to happen. So without further ado, we'll get into a whirlwind tour of the libraries. There is this thing called NarkDB, Kotlin native architecture. That's why it's named that. I built this, and TouchLab built this. What is this? This is an implementation of the SQLite stack on iOS, and then multi-platform, so you can use SQLite with the same API you would use on Android. That is what that is. It literally comes from AOSP, and we converted the Java to Kotlin. Some auto-convert, a lot not. You have to massage that, and threading is way different. C++ comes over too, with a much truncated tree of dependencies, and actually the CTS suite, which tests whether the SQL stuff is doing what you actually expect to be doing. The relevant portions have also been ported over to make sure that I didn't make some horrible mistakes. So that's what happened after coroutines and stuff comes out. This is going to get a big revisit with feedback from other folks. I think it can be cleaned up quite a bit, but that's to be done. It will absolutely work in whatever app you're putting it in. SQLite. This is got many more stars than NarkDB. SQLite is built by Alex Strong at Square, mostly Alex Strong. It is a thing that you write SQL for that generates your classes as opposed to other database tools. We don't say ORMs. You write classes that produce SQL. It is a heavyweight, serious contender in that database library world. He converted it to output common Kotlin instead of Java. What was missing was an iOS side, which is essentially what Nark is. Plus, I wrote the driver, merging thing. So we're kind of independently working together on making you able to do databases on iOS with Kotlin. So if you're going to do anything in the next 6 months with Kotlin Multiplatform on iOS and a database, this is absolutely what you're using, and it works pretty great. This is a relatively complex SQL that I wrote for the droidcon app. You'll notice that there's a join and a group by just to get a comma-separated list of names defined as all names, and on the output code, we get a nullable all names string. It's actually quite useful. And then to round out the community stuff that I found so far, this is Russell Wolf, and he wrote the multi-platform setting library, which delegates between shared preferences on Android and NS user defaults on iOS. It's got quite a succinct and straightforward API. We definitely need some sort of, hey, let me know when you update. We've been chatting about that, but it works quite well. We use it in droidcon as well. So, droidcon Kotlin. This is the droidcon app, or if you run a conference that uses Sessionize, it's your app too. It does iOS and Android. This is open source. You can download it. I think it's the only significant Kotlin multi-platform public example that exists. And I could be totally wrong, but the other ones seem like they're tutorial apps. Go grab it, play around with it. It's cool. Here's some videos of them working. I am not a designer. And these are using material components, new stuff, so I'm not entirely super up to speed on how that works. But yeah, this is the app functioning. This is how it looks today. I just made this while everyone was watching the keynote. And that's it. So if you come to DroidCon NYC, not to pitch another conference at a conference, even though we're all friends, I made DroidCon NYC my own little personal cross-platform summit. So we've got Russell Wolf of the multi-platform settings fame, Alex Strong of the SQLite fame, and then Igor and Jesse Wilson are talking about OKIO and multi-platform, and they haven't released anything yet. So We'll see. I'm not sure what they're actually going to talk about, but I'm super, super excited. We have 5 React Native, 3 Flutter, and 4 Kotlin Multiplatform talks to a total of 20% of the content. So if this is your bag, then definitely come to that thing. Jetbrains is going to be releasing the bulk of what I would call like the really serious libraries in the very near future. And until these materialize, it's kind of hard to move forward. Serialization is the JSON. We're using that in droidcon as well. KTOR is networking. We're not using that yet. It's a little too long to explain why. As is I/O, same reason. Too long to explain why. Because coroutines still does not support multiple threads in Kotlin native. And I don't know if you know much about coroutines. I was just thinking, oh, it's async await. That's cool. And then I really sat down and looked at them. They're amazing. They're going to change a lot of how you code, I think. But they're not ready for multi-threading on Kotlin native. And any day now, but we're all waiting for them. And that's really kind of holding up, I think, a lot of stuff. So we're going to talk quickly about the elephant in the room, which is threads. Threads in Kotlin native are very, very, very different than what you're used to. Kotlin native was not designed as a Java on iOS implementation, as opposed to, say, J2OBJC, which was very much intentionally designed that way. It's like a systems language. And to facilitate simpler memory management and thread safety, they made some decisions that are like very different than what you're used to. I would call some of the things almost Rust-like, if you know Rust at all. State, and really like all of it's kind of about state. And don't worry, we're not getting super in the weeds on this. I'm just going to try to explain it as quickly as possible. There are 2 types of state, and it's regular and frozen. And how do you know which is which? Well, I've created a simple diagram for you to understand which is frozen, which is not. And all the code you've ever written is not frozen. So now you fully understand the distinction. Frozen is a special runtime state. Sorry. Frozen is a special runtime state that is like, this is super immutable. It's not just like a bunch of vals, although if you had a bunch of vals, you could freeze them and it would be fine. It is saying to the runtime, we're super serious, this is frozen. It does some internal optimization under the hood, yada, yada, right? And it's the only way to share data between threads, and I'm serious about that. Don't think otherwise. This, let's say, is your normal object graph, right? There's no garbage collection per se in Kotlin native. There's a thing called the garbage collector. It's really a cycle counter, kind of. Anyway, it's just reference counting to do memory management. And in a normal situation, like let's say a parent or something changes, you kind of need to loop through the tree and sort of make sure everything's okay and manage that stuff, right? When you call freeze, it says essentially everything that's below frozen is going to stay this way forever until we delete it. So there's a lot of assumptions the runtime can make about that piece of data. And yada, yada, that's really interesting. It's getting late in the day. Get to the point. Frozen reference counting is atomic, and non-frozen isn't. And that will screw up your life if you're not super, super careful. You cannot share data across threads if they're not, if it's not frozen, because you're going to get memory leaks, you're going to get crashes. It's just going to happen. And I lost like a few weeks of my life trying to get really cute with Kotlin native and pass like live data around. You just don't do it. So anyway, that's what that is. We're hoping and waiting for support multi-threaded coroutines in Kotlin native. I mean, to be fair, these guys are doing amazing work and they're working really, really hard. And I think it's going to be ready by KotlinConf, but they're starting to really get hammered by people just like freaking out about this not being ready. So what did we do for threads for the droidcon app? Because we obviously have to deal with threads. I hand-rolled some stuff. So there's background task. The first flavor can pass in a front task that you can call when you're done. There's whatever. And all it does is essentially I just freeze everything, and then everything's cool, and it runs. And that works. I also, because I like reactive stuff, I implemented a truncated version of live data on iOS and then created a multi-platform iOS. So when you subscribe to that, the UI will get notified if you update the database, just like you'd expect in any room, whatever situation. I did live data and not RX Java purely because live data is like 5 classes and RX Java would be like 1,000. So it's not, that wouldn't be cool. Anyway, it works, but it's not great. And the reason I really, really didn't want to put a lot of time in it is as soon as coroutine hits, anything you built to try to like hack your way through threading is going to immediately obsolete. And if you know something's going to be obsolete, like don't put that much time into it. I think we're going to do a coroutine sort of powered version of live data once that comes around. And I think some people will like it because it's very simple versus whatever reactive thing's going to come out. But that's that. So my predictions. This is where we're at, V8.2 officially released. The next big thing is going to be KotlinConf. And we'll see what comes out at KotlinConf, right? I think at least a V9X release. They could say 1.0 to make everyone feel comfortable. We'll see. Well, I don't know how it's going to go. There's hopefully going to be fully baked threading because that's really the big thing that's kind of holding stuff up. It's not holding stuff up. You know what I'm saying. Expect several other libs from Jetbrains, and I would expect some community announcements as well. And by the way, if you are thinking about working on this or you're going to release something, let me know because I will be talking at KotlinConf about this, so I can announce your thing at the KotlinConf. So very proud about that. I think it's because there's no one else working on this stuff yet, but you know, not to cut down my own notoriety. All right. Anyway, so again, that's KotlinConf. After that, it's a little more speculative. You know, definitely a V1. I think once these things get established, and especially once the tooling gets kind of solved, you're going to really see a ramp up of library releases in Q4. It's going to really start to pick up, and then Q5. I think there's going to be a major reactive lib, something Mr. Wharton worked on called Reagent, which looks really cool, but it had to wait, again, because there's no coroutines. I think that would be, it's sort of like taking all the stuff about RX that doesn't make sense for mobile and removing it. So it looks pretty cool. I think that'd be nice. We need to date the library. There'll be improved tooling. They'll probably be working on making the builds more efficient to appease people. And then I would say Q2 and onward is mainstream time. It's going to be big apps. Crossing my fingers to get WebAssembly threads. See how that goes. If you don't know what that is, go look at WebAssembly. It's pretty interesting. Yada, yada. After that, I mean, I'm guessing what's going to be at KotlinConf. So I have no idea what's happening next year other than it'll get more mainstream. If you've ever wanted to get really involved in open source, I will tell you a little secret. Get involved early. This is what the database library situation looked like in 2010 for Android, and I really didn't like active Android, so I'm sticking my tongue out at it. This is what it looks like today, and that is barely scratching the surface of all the smaller ones I found. I used to know all of them, and I have lost touch. I just Googled it, and there were way more than I put in that list. How easy do you think it would be to have an impact on SQLite in Java/Android in 2018 as an individual? I would say not easy, because there's so many things. I wrote the original port of ORM Lite. I didn't even write ORM Lite. I was the one that took the JDBC version and got it to work on Android. And every one of you in your pocket, if you have an Android phone, have crap that I wrote in your pocket, and I put like 2-3 weeks of work total into that. So, yeah, if you want to have an impact and be involved in open source, it's better to get started early. Here's what we are, and that includes not just database stuff, but like everything else. And now's the time, essentially, is the message. You got it. Also, I think it's important to reach out to the iOS community because, you know, Kotlin's very Swift-like. This is a very mobile-first situation that we're trying to build as opposed to a React Native that's like a web first, a JavaScript has to be everything situation. I think that these are natural friends, except that if you say to an iOS developer, hey, why don't you think about less Swift, they're going to get upset. Take them out for a drink, talk to them. That's kind of where my head's at. And that, of course, is it. We are actively looking for orgs who want to really try to use this stuff inside of their application architectures. We are essentially doing this as a consulting company to pivot around this technology and be there when it really starts to pick up to be doing that kind of work, right, and be the thought leaders. We are, of course, hiring soonish for people that are really into the multi-platform stuff. We're generally hiring for people that want to build apps, you know, regular apps, but the multi-platform stuff, we're crossing our fingers on a meeting next week. See how it goes. Blah, blah, blah. Follow me on Twitter. I'm going to send out a big list of resources later today. I actually did a self-record. I'm going to see if I can make a video out of this or if it's going to be trash, and I'll try to publish that later. And I do a bunch of Medium posts and talk about this stuff kind of all the time. Yada, yada, yada. Oh, and as discussed, we're going to have all that stuff at droidcon, so you should definitely check out the droidcon, which is in less than 2 weeks. We have a special code, Android Summit, and you should use it in case you want to come to the droidcon. That's it.